Hi everyone, I'm Jaclyn Skinner and I am the YPAHD president, and I am honored today to be sitting here with Dr. Guttman. He is the director of the Center for Movement Disorders here in Toronto, and he's a consultant to CHDI and actively engaged in many HD research collaborations. Thank you for joining us today. We are here today and we are going to talk about clinical trials from the view of a participant. So what things you can expect and what things are important to know and stuff like that. So Dr. Guttman, thank you very much for meeting with us.
It's a pleasure. I'm sorry I'm not able to be in person at the symposium. We're actually doing an outreach program that I go to Northern Ontario to see patients with Huntington. So it's not like I'm not being available. We just had other things booked. Sorry.
That's okay. We all need you all over the province, so it's understandable. So basically, we're just going to get started and talk about clinical trials, and as they're so important in our community, and especially with moving forward in the fight to cure HD. So what exactly is a clinical trial?
So that's a good question. When we do clinical research, we want to have, at the end of the day, an answer to the question, is a therapy, a drug, something else, effective? Does it work? And is it safe? So a clinical trial is designed to ask a specific research question, and that may be, can a drug slow Huntington's progression? Could a drug stop Huntington's starting in somebody who has the gene? Or could it help certain symptoms of Huntington? So the research question is very important in a way that's conclusive to see if there's an effect. And we use things called outcome measures. So we measure things between before and after. And then we ask the question, is there any side effects, or what is the safety of the drug? So you can imagine that we want medications or things that can work to help people, the symptoms that are in question, but we don't want to make them sick. So is it safe, and is it effective? So clinical trials are programs that are set up, and we have to really be very careful about the design. It's all about the design to say, okay, if we do something, how's it going to be? And that is very individual depending on what we're studying. It may be medication, it may be surgery, it may be exercise. So the intervention can vary quite a bit.
Awesome. And what clinical trials are available for someone like myself to participate in? Like, do I have to know my results? Do I not have to know? What options are there?
So when we do a clinical trial, it depends very much on what phases of clinical trials that we're involved with. So let's talk about clinical trials 101.
Okay.
So there is something called phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, phase 4.
Makes sense.
So when we deal with a drug in development, these things are very well defined by our regulatory agency. So in Canada, that's Health Canada. In the States, it's the FDA. There's a European medication authority called EMEA. So they set up the guidelines. So the phase 1 studies, and this will be of interest because there's things going on relating to Huntington's that are starting, they look at normal, healthy volunteers, and they deal mostly with safety.
Okay.
Does a drug make you sick? Because in a healthy volunteer, you can't tell if it's going to help somebody with Huntington's.
Okay.
A phase 2 study is involved with the initial patient experience. So, say in Huntington's disease, does a drug help Huntington's patients? Is it safe in Huntington's patients? Because it may be safe in normal healthy volunteers, but Huntington's may be different. And the next question is, what are the doses that could be effective? So a phase 2 study asks, in the disease population in Huntington's, does something potentially have the chance to work? What are the side effects? And what are the doses that could work? Phase 3 are mostly the larger studies that lead to what's called registration or approval by the government. So phase 3 is usually many different places, and it's really global. Canada is an important part of Huntington's research, but we do these studies and they're going on in US, they're going on in Europe, they're going on lots of other places. So they're large multi-center studies that involve large numbers of people, and hopefully we pick the dose right, and hopefully we know a bit about the safety so we can know what to assess during the time. And finally, there are drugs that are approved for other things that are not officially approved for Huntington's disease, and after they're approved and in general use, you can actually have a phase 4 study. That's what phase 4 refers to, a drug that's already approved that is asking a different research question: could it be used in this other therapeutic area? So something that may be for Alzheimer's, could it be used for Huntington's, or vice versa? So those are the general frameworks. So mostly the phase 1 stuff is done in healthy students. They get paid, and there you go. But in Huntington's disease, there's a number of phase 2 studies. These are exploratory studies that are going on with drugs that make sense in the laboratory, make sense in animal models, that hopefully are going to work in Huntington's patients, but we don't know, because a mouse is a different thing than a person. Yes. So there's a lot that goes behind the scenes before it ever gets to people. We need to know a lot about the molecule, what the characteristics, the pharmacology of the molecule are. In other words, how does it work? We need to know that there's a good chance that it's going to do something in Huntington's patients. And that's largely based on the understanding of what happens in Huntington's, and also what is going on in animal models. Okay. So when the gene was discovered in 1993, fantastic things happened, because you could take the gene of a Huntington's patient that's abnormal, has an expanded CAG repeat length, and then you could put it in a mouse, or a fruit fly, or now sheep and monkeys, and you have these animal models of Huntington's, and you can test out, does a drug work in a bunch of different parameters. Now, they can't tell you how their symptoms are, but they can talk. They can give us information about how does it change the process of Huntington's, how does the brain change, sometimes symptom change. So hopefully, before we get to a clinical trial in a person, we have interesting information about the pharmacology of the drug, how does it work. We have interesting information that in animal models of Huntington's, it is working. And then we go to people. Okay. So each time we have a clinical trial, and we can talk in more details later on, there's something called the inclusion and exclusion criteria. Okay. And that really sets the stage for who can get involved, what the criteria are, and it's really to optimize the research question. So, for instance, there's some clinical trials that are going on right now that are hopefully going to see if a drug that reduces inflammation in the brain, as an example, this is the Legato study. I'll get into specifics. We can talk about generalities, but this is a good example. They want to see within a 1-year time frame, does this medication help symptoms of Huntington's and maybe slow progression? Okay. So first of all, you need to have somebody who has symptoms. If you have somebody who doesn't have symptoms, how can we measure that? We want to have a good sense that within that 1-year time frame, so the study design is 1 year, that you have a chance of seeing a change. Huntington's is usually a very slowly evolving condition for most part, but we know that some people with Huntington's go very quickly, the juvenile patients, the teenage onset patients. So they have excluded those people because there's an age that is specific. You need to be over a certain age to get in, and that will take away these different kinds of patients, so you have a homogeneous, a consistent group. We also know that people that develop Huntington's who are later in life change more slowly. And with the later in life onset, usually there's a lower CAG repeat length. So for the first time in a clinical trial, we've actually had inclusion criteria that you need to be within a certain frame of the CAG repeat length. So to answer your question earlier, do you need to be tested or not? In this particular study, not only do you have to have symptoms, but you have to have genetic testing. So, many people have symptoms, but they haven't had testing, and we need to know what their test results are. That can be done within the study, but it needs to be bracketed that they have to be over a certain amount and under a certain other amount. So if they're too large, they're likely to have the younger onset, more rapid progression. If they're too small, they're going to have the later onset and slower progression.
Too slow.
So part of the research design, for instance, in this clinical trial, is to be able to fit within an age criteria.
Okay.
So the older people, I think the cutoff, if I remember correctly, is age 60. I can check that later. But the CAG repeat length, and those are different things. We haven't had that before. So stepping back and answering some other aspects of your question, you said, who can get involved?
Yeah.
I've glossed over something that's, I think, very important, and there's something called observational studies that are not part of clinical trials. So clinical trials can include observational studies, but most of the time we talk about drug intervention or some kind of intervention. So, it's possible to be involved in research and to be part of this thing called Enroll-HD. You might have heard of it.
Yes, I have.
And in Enroll-HD, we don't give somebody anything. It's not. We measure how they are on an annual basis to be able to determine how Huntington's changes over time for people who are at different stages of the game. So anybody who has a risk of Huntington's can get involved. So the young people who have a parent with Huntington's but haven't been tested, they can get involved. You can get involved if you've been tested and either have the expansion or don't. So we want people who are controls that don't have the gene expansion, so they've been tested that are new, or that have the gene and you can not have symptoms and participate, or you can have symptoms throughout the changes of Huntington's. So we're looking at a whole bunch of things there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right now we have about 8,000 people in this study. It's going on around the world. We're running it like a clinical trial. So what does that mean? It means that we have very clear standards that we have to deal with. So when we do a study, we have to make sure that the data is accurate. It's double checked by third parties to make sure things are going. It's entered into computer systems. The data is cleaned. It's done in a way that would be the same as a clinical trial for drugs. We want to make sure the data is really, really good. We're doing this for a bunch of reasons. We want to have a list of people who could participate in clinical trials. So one of the rate limiting steps, one of the things that we have the most difficulties with, is getting people that are eligible for clinical trials. So within Enroll, if you participate in Enroll, we have an anonymous list of how you are at this time. And when we do clinical trials for some of the drugs in development, we can go to the Enroll database and say, okay, I need somebody who's between the ages of 25 and 60, has a CAG repeat length of this to this, has a certain motor test result, and has a certain total functional capacity, meaning how are they doing on a day-to-day basis. And I get a printout. So then I call those people and say, do you want to be in this trial? We need you, exactly. And this is highly likely to improve the rate or speed of getting people who are eligible and want to participate into a clinical trial. So it's really a database. Other things that we're doing within Enroll involve mathematical modeling. How many people do we need in studies? How long do studies need to be? If a drug is going to do X, slow progression, help symptoms, we can calculate how many people we need based on this preliminary information, which is really helpful. I'm involved in something different. We're doing research in how to improve clinical care in people who have symptomatic Huntington's. So there's a care improvement committee that is going to utilize the data in the symptomatic people. So we'll be able to say, okay, if we do something to that person, encourage exercise, have home care, have certain medications, could we actually have a better outcome compared to those that aren't using them? And this is evidence-based or data-based research that we can look at large numbers of people. And Huntington's is a pretty rare condition, right? So, I have about 200 patients that I look after, which is on the large size based on surveys of how Huntington centers are. But there's no way I can do, look to see in the last 10,000 people I treated, how does it work? So that'll be much better to actually improve care for patients. And finally, there's genetic research going on that will look at things that could help us understand Huntington's more. So we know the CAG repeat length helps us to determine is somebody going to develop symptoms. It doesn't really help us for the most part in when Huntington's starts and how fast it progresses. So there's something called genetic modifiers. So other genes that you may have or somebody might have that has the Huntington's gene that could slow it down or speed it up. So there's a group at Harvard, Jim Gusella, Marcy McDonald, two Canadians, Jim's from Ottawa, Marcy's from Timmins, so yay for Canada. So they are doing research on the samples that we get from Enroll, and there's some preliminary data about some new genes that they're just discovering because they've had so many samples, and this is from some of the other observational studies. There's something called Predict, there's another thing called Pharos, there's other programs that we've had before. So anyways, the genetic modifiers could really help because if we find a gene that slows progression and we can figure out what that gene does, that would be helpful.
Absolutely.
So I hope I'm not getting too detailed, but there's observational studies that people can get involved with. But ultimately the question is, in the clinical trials that are being planned and are ongoing now, there's some questions that are being asked. So one study asked the question, could a drug help motor symptoms of Huntington's, both involuntary movements and voluntary movements? So that's a drug called Pridopidine, and it's from Teva, and we're involved in a clinical trial with that, and that's called PRIDE-HD. So it's a study that's a year long, that people are asked to have a certain amount of symptoms, moderate level of Huntington's symptoms, so that we can measure a change. And there's a whole bunch of doses, 4 different doses of this drug versus a placebo. So there's a concept there that I haven't mentioned. When we do things on a research basis, we want to make sure that it's scientifically valid. So just by coming into a study, we know that people have hope that they're going to get better. They see the doctor more, they see the study nurses, they see people, and they're surrounded by activity, and they come in more often, and maybe that just makes them better. So we have to be able to scientifically say the treatment is the thing that's doing it, rather than the extra experience. And so that's why within the studies there's always a placebo group. So in that particular study there's 4 different drug doses. We don't know what they're going to get. There's a placebo group, we don't know if they're in that group, and the patient doesn't know either. So there's a technical term called a double blind. Each person doesn't know, the study team and the person. Placebo controlled, so there's always a chance of getting a sugar pill that doesn't have the active medication. Clinical trial that is meant to prove something. So in that particular study, it's to look at, could that help symptoms of Huntington's? And we know in previous studies they almost made it to the finish line, that it showed a little bit of change. But in this particular study, they're using higher doses, a few higher doses than they used before. So they're hoping higher doses don't cause side effects and help them more.
So what does informed consent mean?
So really you're talking about what is the process of getting involved, and what do you have to do to get involved. So the process of getting involved means somebody has to be interested, and they have to be approached. And part of the whole Huntington Side of Canada program is to sort of link the people together that are doing research and the patients and their families. And they doing an excellent job getting the information out. There's a whole map of Canada where clinical trials are, what's going on. HD Buzz, you've heard of HD Buzz?
Yes, great.
It gives us an idea of what the basic research and some of the other clinical research and fantastic decoding of that scientific information. So once people know what's going on, then they have to be approached. So there's study sites like ours in Toronto and other places across the country that are involved. So you have to link the people that want to get involved to the people that are getting involved. So in my patient population, I tell people what's going on. Sometimes they ask, sometimes we say, we're recruiting for this clinical trial. There's a basic principle that's called informed consent. So for you to participate in a study, you have to know all the good things and all the bad things. And here's what an informed consent looks like. It's like 20 pages long.
It's a mini book.
Yeah, it's a mini book. And essentially it involves some basic principles. So why are we doing this study? Is it to help symptoms? Is it to slow progression? What's involved in the study? So how many times do you have to come in? What are you going to do each time?
Okay.
What are the risks in the study? What are the side effects that are known from the current usage in other studies? Sometimes we just don't know. And what are the potential problems just by participating in the study? So, if you don't like having blood samples, it's not a good idea.
Yeah, it might not be for you.
Yeah, and even in the observational study in Enroll, I've had some people say, I have to give a blood sample. This isn't for me. This is like too much. And we try to give you an idea how long each visit takes. And it's very variable depending on the visit. And so how often are the visits? How many times do you have to come in? How long is the study? All these things are set out in the informed consent.
Okay.
It's really important not to be pressured to participate. So it's not like, hello, you're here, sign this, we're going to start today. No, that doesn't work like that. Part of the principle is that you need to have a chance to think about this, to ask questions, to talk to other people, and that's really an important part of participating in the studies. Because if you start and think about doing it just because it's the right thing to do, and you really don't know what you're getting involved with, it's not good. So, we emphasize, do you know what's involved? Do you know how long it's going to take? If you have a job that you have to leave once a week, one of the studies, they have to come in every week for the first month or so.
Okay.
That's a big deal.
Yeah.
Where do you live? We have people flying in from Timmins for studies. So, how does that work? You got to come, and the visits may start early in the morning. So where are you going to stay and all that kind of stuff. So there's logistical things. So the consent is the first process. Do you know what you're going to get involved with? And most people that are involved in the current clinical trials can understand what's going on. But obviously in Huntington's patients, sometimes they can't understand. None of the current clinical trials, apart from the observational study with Enroll, involve people who have cognitive impairment. But there may be a time that that's going to happen, and there may be a situation that somebody who's acting in the best interest of the patient will give that consent. But that's unusual right now. So, first process, do you know what you're getting into? And informed consent is a process throughout the study, but you actually have to sign. And you have to say, I know what we're getting involved with, and as the principal investigator, as the person in charge, I have to make sure that that individual actually knows what they're doing. So once you get the informed consent, the first visit is what we call a screening assessment. So usually you have to have stuff done. There's a physical examination, making sure you don't have any other medical problems. There's blood tests to make sure maybe there's something going on you don't even know about that could have an impact. You have to have ECGs usually. And then it varies tremendously within studies. So one of the studies you actually have an MRI before you start. And the MRI test is usually done, we don't have one here, and we have to go to set it up, and there's that logistically that's done at the beginning and the end of the study to compare what the results are. There's all sorts of fancy equipment these days. So when we're doing assessments in Huntington's, we want to look at how does Huntington's affect you. So there's physical changes, physical examination. There's motor changes. So I do something called the Unified Huntington's Disease Rating Scale. That gives me certain information. But there's also this fancy computerized strategy called Q-Motor that a computer is set up, and it measures motor function in a whole bunch of ways. And it's done in a standardized way, and it's from Germany, and the results go to Germany to get interpreted. So that takes about half an hour. Then there's this fancy cognitive assessment battery, and CHDI was involved with Julie Stout, who's now in Australia, to do that. So she's participated in a number of the studies, so we have this computer cognitive assessment. That takes another half hour. And then there's all these questionnaires to fill out. So I ask a questionnaire about psychiatric assessments, there's depression assessments, there's activities of daily living, and other kinds of assessments. So as part of this study, you can be here for a while. A long time. So one guy came in today at 8 o'clock. I saw he was still here at 4. It was a full day. That doesn't happen like that all the time. But you need to know how long that is. And we want to give them breaks, and we need to
make
have
them
space.
real comfortable, right?
Yeah. Some of the studies now involve invasive things.
Okay.
Spinal tap. So in Vancouver, Dr. Levitt and his group are involved in a study that is going to be infusing, so inserting into the spinal fluid, this new medication. So, you know, if you're not good on needles being stuck
then
in your
maybe a
back,
spinal tap might not be for you.
And in that study, you actually have to be admitted to hospital to be observed.
Oh, okay.
So that's a big deal.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And you have to be available, and you can only live within a certain distance, because if something went wrong, you have to be available to go back to the hospital.
Makes sense.
So every study is different, but you know, it can be for enroll, it's about an hour and a half time, up to 6 to 8 hours time.
Just depending on the time. For people who like fly in from Timmins or anywhere for that matter, is there is their cost covered, or do they have to pay for this kind of stuff?
Yeah, so it depends on the study. So if things are sponsored by pharmaceutical companies, we ask permission for them for their costs to be covered. And part of my job in negotiating things for a study are to try and do that. And for the most part, that's been successful. So yes, the people from Timmins get their air tickets provided, their hotel provided. We have some people that are coming from different parts. So there's one person coming from Kingston. We send a car to pick them up to drive them in because they can't drive, and somebody from Kitchener that's going to do the same thing. So you know, there's all sorts of logistical things, and for the most part, everything's provided. Sometimes they have to pay a little bit out of pocket and they get reimbursed. But the whole idea is to make it easy, but within reason. So we had some patients from YPAHD that were going to fly in for a study, but it was going to cost $60,000 for the transportation for the study.
Oh my God.
So the sponsor said, you know what, sorry, it's not going to work. So, you know, it's within reason. So part of being in a study is we're not supposed to induce you with payment. So you're not supposed to be making decisions based on, I'm going to make money from this.
Yeah.
But you should be reasonably compensated for your costs.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And that's mostly what people would just want, right? So after you're done, like the year, let's say, is the study, do you find out your results? Do you have the conversation saying it worked, it didn't work, this is the next phase?
Sure. So certainly the expectation and obligation for the guy in charge of the study at the site, that would be me, to tell each individual patient what they got. You know, what dose of the medication, or if they got placebo. The challenge is that that doesn't happen until it's all finished. So not when you finished your year, if it's a year-long study, but everybody has to have finished. They have to clean the database, make sure that there's no outstanding questions, and they have to do something called a database lock. So they have to say, okay, no one's going to mess with this database, no one's going to change anything after these results are. So typically that takes a while after. So that's part of the challenge, because people would like to know as soon as they finish, what did I get?
Yeah.
And we have to be very clear that you'll get that information, but it's got to wait. And you know, if you're the last person that's gone through the study, it'll be sooner. But for instance, in the National Institute of Health sponsored study with coenzyme Q10, it was a 5-year-long study, and we had patients that actually had finished 2 years before other people did. So it was a
waiting game for them.
Yeah. One of the concepts we haven't talked about is that in many of the studies, there's this double-blind phase that we don't know what they get, and they don't know.
Okay.
But they may be offered what's called an open-label extension. So that's, what does that mean? That means that at the end of the study, you'll be offered to get the real stuff.
Okay.
So, and that's sometimes a really good thing. So you'll know, even if you got placebo, at the, you know,
at the end you'll be.
Yeah. So one of the studies is a 6-month study, and then you get offered the real stuff, and then you have the chance to say, did this work for me? Did it have side effects? And the hope is to continue that until it's available to the general public, and some of the studies will sort of just start that process, and there could be extensions along the way. So, you know, we always want to think of the patient first, and it's always nice to be able to offer something that they can try after. But in the earlier phase studies, sometimes the sponsors just feel that they don't have enough safety information to extend it indefinitely, or they may not be sure what the result is going to be and don't have the financial resources to commit to that. So not all of them have that.
Okay. Awesome. Well, I know like one of the big things that I think about when people start trials and stuff like that is the possible risks, and obviously you want the benefits to be that it works and it makes us one step closer. But what if somebody gets like the other side effects, or it does something else? Like,
so it's part of my responsibility and my study staff, and by the way, we have like research assistants and nurses and people to try and help out. So it's not something that sort of your corner doctor can do easily, because we need people that are experienced. But so we're monitoring this closely, and it's my responsibility, if there is a side effect that comes out, to look after that person. And hopefully that there's never a serious side effect, but certainly it's my obligation to, and all people running studies, to make sure that people get to the care that they need. And you know, we're lucky in Canada, healthcare is healthcare. The government systems provide that irrespective. Sometimes in the studies, if there's a need to have a rapid assessment by a specialist, I remember being involved in one study that somebody had some liver problems, it wasn't Huntington's, and they said, you know, you can't wait for the usual lineup that we have in our wonderful province. Anyway, so they actually paid extra for somebody to be seen. And sometimes that happens.
Okay.
You know, part of the obligation is that the sponsor, if it is a drug study, has an obligation to protect the patients as well.
Okay.
So if there's ever anything terrible, you can never, you know, erase the obligation from the sponsor. Just like if you took a drug that was already marketed and something terrible happened, you could go back to that company and say, you know, you made me sick, and you know, there's been examples of people being compensated for that, but you know, that's very rare.
Okay. Yeah. So if somebody was started the trial and then kind of like they did the informed consent, they knew it was going to happen, but then kind of had second guesses about it halfway through, are they able to leave the trial?
Absolutely.
Okay.
So informed consent, meaning I'd like to do this, can be removed at any time.
Okay.
Okay, so you can wake up one day and say, you know what, I'm out of here, and it's my job to say, that's okay. It's not going to affect your care in the future. It doesn't mean like, okay, so you sent me, so you're not in my practice anymore.
Okay.
There's an ethical obligation to say that's acceptable, and we support that all the time. You know, on the other hand, it's important for people to sort of take this seriously and say, okay, if I'm getting into a one-year commitment, do I really want to do that? Is that something that's, you know, but people can change their minds. So we're hoping that people take it seriously. We give them enough opportunity to understand what they're getting into. And if it doesn't work out for whatever reason, and it may be things that you can't predict. There may be other health issues, there may be other things in your family, there may be just a lack of interest. So that's totally acceptable.
Okay, awesome. I know, like, I know a lot of HD affected people, and I know one of the big things that they always ask when you go to like the national conferences and hear all the good things happening. Can you go on more than one trial? Like, if you're doing one, can you take drugs for another, or does that kind of
good question?
defeat the purpose?
So that's not on.
Okay.
So if you're in one study, according to Health Canada and FDA guidelines, you can only be on one research product at a time. So, and you can understand that if you're taking something and something went wrong, or if you're taking two things, you wouldn't know which was what. And these are not approved products, so we don't really know everything about it. Again, one of the reasons to do these studies is to look at safety. What could the side effects be? And certainly if you get two products that you don't know what their safety is and you put them together, maybe they're going to be a lot worse. So so it's part of the exclusion criteria when we bring people into studies that they can't be on another clinical trial. And there's usually a time window from stopping a study to starting another one, and that's defined within each study. So we've had some people that did study number one, said, okay, that didn't work for me, let's try study number two. they wait a month or 2 months or whatever. Then so that's perfectly acceptable.
Okay.
But to do both at the same time would not be within the guidelines from the government.
So if I was part of a trial, or anybody for that matter, how would it affect your daily life? Like, the idea obviously is that it's not going to be too disruptive, but what would a week in the life of a person be?
So the hope is that it would make you better, and your symptoms would improve and you wouldn't have any side effects. So obviously anything can happen. There may not be any change. You might, we have people coming in for studies and say, do you feel better? Do you feel worse? I say, no difference. So that's not a negative thing. You'd like to feel better. But there could be side effects, and there could be something that causes problems, and sometimes the side effects aren't even noticeable. So we have some people that have blood test abnormalities that we have to monitor. But one thing's clear is that you have to follow certain rules of the road. So many of the medications have potential medications that they could interact with.
Okay.
So you have to watch your general health. If you're healthy, you don't need any other prescription drugs, that's one thing. But we were dealing with a situation in the last couple of days that somebody who's working and was pretty good developed an infection and got put on an antibiotic, and oops, the antibiotic's on the list of things that you can't take. Okay. So you have to monitor and have that extra sort of vigilance that, okay, if something happens health-wise, you have to ask the question, how does the study affect that? Are drugs acceptable with the study medication, or are there more risks to you if you combine medications? Sometimes there's diets that aren't allowed. That's a bit unusual. Some of the studies are getting involved with saying health food products are not allowed. So, I'm not quite sure why, but and some of the things that have been used in Huntington's, like fish oils and coenzyme Q10 and some other stuff, they're saying you can't take those, or some of them say you can. So there's different things that you might not think about, but could affect that. Okay, so the trials aren't going to interfere too much with your daily life. Obviously, they want you to kind of stick to it as much as possible, because hopefully this is going to help us out. It depends on what you do in your daily life. Some of the studies say you can only drink a certain amount of alcohol. So
I don't want to be on that one. So it might be difficult for some people. So you said something about if you get sick and you're on an antibiotic, if you have to take a different medication while you're on a trial or something, who is there to help you? You said something about having nurses and people looking after your care. Are those people available to call? If you had a question, if you got sick and just wanted to go see them first, or just to keep yourself safe?
There's different strategies. So our staff accept calls relating to the study, but we're not here 24 hours a day and 7 days a week. So if there's an emergency, there's an emergency number on the consent form to call. There's sometimes there's an emergency thing that happens and you need to be what's called unblinded. So something's going on that they want to know, is this related to, well, if you're on placebo, then it's probably not that. But we take that very seriously, because when you're unblinded in the study, that potentially not only affects your future use of the study medication and involvement, but it could potentially bias me if I know how you've been doing during the study, and then I know what the study drug is, then that might mess up my experience with other people that I'm involved with. So they don't like that unblinding, but it is a possibility for safety reasons.
Okay, yeah, because I know some people haven't told their family physician or whatever if they've been tested and stuff, so they might not feel comfortable going there. So it's nice to know that they do have an outlet if that's the case.
And in many of these 20-page documents, there's a little box saying, I allow you to communicate with the family physician relating to being involved in the study. And usually we let them know what the study is about and ask them to say, contact us if there's stuff going on during the time.
Awesome. So that's all up to the participant. That's nice.
So there's some studies that are coming up that are pretty invasive.
Okay.
So, it's one thing taking a drug and doing some computer stuff and, things like that. So, some of the studies that are being envisioned, this one in Vancouver that's going on in other places as well, involves testing your spinal fluid and putting things into the spinal fluid space on a regular basis. So, that's pretty invasive. It's you haven't experienced this, but it's like having an epidural for a woman or a spinal tap to look for infection.
Yeah.
So it's not a huge ordeal, but there could be headaches and other things. You could get an infection from that, so that's one thing. There are some of the studies that are being planned that may actually involve brain surgery. So, some of these Huntington lowering strategies where the effects of the abnormal DNA can be blocked either by preventing it from copying to RNA or preventing the RNA from making protein, can be entered into the system by different strategies. So the spinal fluid is one system. There's good data suggesting that it'll cover the brain, but we don't know it'll go into the deep parts of the brain sufficiently.
Okay.
So there's discussion about having what's called stereotactic surgery, where your friendly corner neurosurgeon drills a hole in your skull and sticks a probe into the areas that are mostly affected with Huntington's and inserts the drug that's put in a Trojan horse kind of thing, which is a virus, and the virus spreads to the cells of the brain and delivers the drug through that process. And we're actually talking about that. And I've met with the head of neurosurgery at the University in Toronto, and we're ready to go when it's ready to go. And that's probably coming in the next year or two.
That's insane.
So on one hand, you can have an observational study that you come in and you talk to me for an hour and a half, or you can have neurosurgery where they're sticking probes in your brain, and so there's
one spectrum to the other, right?
Right. So what is it going to need to make a huge difference in Huntington's? We don't know, and the more invasive we are, the more risk there is, and the more chance of side effects. So we have to be very careful of what to do.
So if you took somebody who is really advanced, it's not going to reverse it, but it would just stall it wherever they are? Is that the idea?
So once brain cells are lost, they don't reproduce. So you'd have to have a strategy, and maybe something is coming in the future that you can put in cells to replace those that are lost. But it's fair to say that it's hopeful that some of these new strategies will take a sick cell and make them better. So they may not be functioning, but you can't sort of have cells reproduce unless there's a way of turning on something called stem cells, and so we're still not sure how to do that.
So I understand that you participate in HD clinical trials consortium meetings. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
So I think the Huntington Society of Canada is doing a fantastic job, and I think it's really trend-setting for countries around the world and support groups. So if you are involved in a Huntington's family, if you're from a Huntington's family and you live somewhere and you want to get involved in clinical trials, you need to have somebody around there that knows what they're doing, is experienced, and can help you participate. So the reality is that big places, Toronto, Vancouver, Montreal, we've got people like me that are doing this and that are good at what they're doing, and we have lots of geographic misses. So there's places in the country that you might live that may not have this. So through this workshop and program that's being headed through the Huntington Society of Canada, and there's a whole bunch of volunteers that are participating. Diego Mestra is a neurologist who's now in Ottawa. He's in charge of it. There's clinical trial nurses that are from Edmonton and research managers that are part of it. So we're trying to get a multidisciplinary approach to support people that say, you know what, I've been doing clinical work on Huntington's. Maybe I need to take that next step to be involved in clinical trials. So if you were young and innocent and just starting your practice as a young neurologist, and there's a few of them like that in places like Hamilton and other locations, and you've never been trained in clinical trials, how do you set that up? Okay. So we're trying to create this workshop to say, okay, let's see how you do this. What do you need? What kind of support do you need from your hospital, or if you're in private practice, what do you need? How do you start getting ready to do a clinical trial, and some people have never had any experience with it, so it's pretty complicated. You have to have the right staff, you have to have a place that has enough space, you have to have sort of knowledge about each step of the way.
Okay.
And there are certain things that we can do to help mentor these younger individuals to form a cohesive group across the country, so that there's geographic linkage and sharing information. And we're actually having a meeting next Monday about this. This is I think the third or fourth meeting in this sort of thing, that we're trying to pull together guidelines of how to do this and ultimately create more sites across the country that can participate in studies.
So thank you very much, Dr. Guttman. You gave us lots of information, and I think anybody from being gene negative to being full out symptomatic can find a place to help out in the fight against HD. I really appreciate it. I've learned a lot today, and definitely will be taking some notes back to my family. So thank you all for participating and listening. Please stay tuned for the question and answer period, followed by our second session hosted by Bev. Thank you.